talking about the largest of the cranial nerves, that is the trigeminal. Trigeminal nerve is the largest cranial nerve. Its ganglion, the semilunar or the Gasserian ganglion, it consists of the pseudo-unipolar nerve cells. What do you mean by pseudo-unipolar nerve cells? Unipolar nerve cells are the nerve cells which have only one axon arising from it, while the bipolars are the one that have two axons arising from them. These bipolars, the examples are the olfactory nerve, while in semilunar ganglion, the nerve cell, they have a single axon that goes for some distance and then divides into the two axons. These kind of the nerve cells, they are called as pseudo-unipolar nerve cells. This is the typical of Gasserian ganglion and an MCQ. The Gasserian ganglion is crescent-shaped and has three roots that emerge from the convex portion. It is situated in the Meckel's cave. This Meckel's cave is formed by the fold of the dura mater. The cranial nerve 5, the trigeminal nerve, is mostly sensory, with only a small motor root that joins only the mandibular branch once it enters the foramen ovale. In this diagram, we can see the Meckel's cave formed by the folding of the dura mater, and this is the trigeminal ganglion lodged into the Meckel's cave. In this diagram, we can see the crescent-shaped trigeminal ganglion. Here, this ganglion mainly acts as a region of synapse for the sensory fibers of the trigeminal nerve. These are the three branches of the trigeminal nerve. The first branch, that is the ophthalmic nerve, enters through the superior orbital fissure. Here, the second branch, that is the maxillary branch, enters through the foramen rotundum. Here, and the third branch, that is the mandibular branch, enters from foramen ovale. Here, the motor nerve, the motor branch, does not join the nerves at this area in the intracranial. It enters the foramen ovale along with the mandibular nerve, and after exiting the cranial cavity, then it joins the mandibular nerve to supply the muscles of the mastication. The location of the Gasserian ganglion is here. This is the root of the petrous temporal bone. So we have MCQ about the foramens. We have MCQ about the shape. We have MCQ about the motor nerves, about the Meckel cave, and the position of the Gasserian ganglion. So the trigeminal nerve has three major branches: the ophthalmic nerve, the maxillary nerve, and the mandibular nerve. Ophthalmic nerve is the smallest and it enters through superior orbital fissure. Maxillary nerve, it leaves through foramen rotundum, while mandibular nerve leaves through foramen ovale. In this diagram, we can see the position of branches of the ophthalmic nerve. The two branches of the ophthalmic nerve that pass through the superior orbital fissure are the lacrimal nerve and the frontal nerve. So you can see that the ophthalmic nerve divides into its branches before it enters the superior orbital fissure. One more point to be noted here is about the position of these branches related to the annular ring or the common tendinous ring. These branches lie outside or lateral to the tendinous ring. Here again we can see the position of the branches of the ophthalmic nerve. This is the lacrimal nerve and this is the frontal nerve. This diagram of superior orbital fissure is very important and is a source of a lot of MCQs. So be very thorough with this diagram. Now we will see the branches of the ophthalmic nerve. In the middle cranial fossa, the branches are the nervus tentori and the communicating branches to the adjacent nerve, that is the third nerve, the sixth nerve, and the fourth nerve. When the nerve passes through the cavernous sinus, we have already seen that the cavernous sinus, the lateral wall of cavernous sinus houses a lot of nerves, the third nerve, the fourth nerve, and the fifth nerve branches. When the first branch of the fifth nerve passes in the lateral wall of the cavernous sinus, it gives three branches. The lacrimal branch that supplies the lacrimal gland, conjunctiva, and the skin. Actually, this lacrimal branch, it carries the postganglionic fibers from the sphenopalatine ganglion. Now we have seen the sphenopalatine ganglion is a ganglion of seventh nerve. But this ganglion is situated very close to maxillary nerve, which is a branch of fifth nerve. We'll be talking about this a little later. The second branch is the frontal branch that gives the supraorbital and the supratrochlear branch. And the third branch is the nasociliary that gives the long ciliary nerves, the branch to the ciliary ganglion. We have seen in the ciliary ganglion that a branch from nasociliary comes and passes uninterrupted through the ganglion. So this is this branch. And we have the posterior and the anterior ethmoidal branches and the nasal branches. Now we will see the ophthalmic nerve in the dissection. As we saw earlier, the trigeminal nerve emerges from the pons and passes forward. Here is the skull with the dural covering. The nerve passes forwards from the pons into a tunnel in the dura. The tunnel leads to a side cavity, the trigeminal cave, that is the fold of the dura, which we will expose now by removing the dura. Here is the trunk of the nerve, and here are its branches: the ophthalmic, the maxillary, and the mandibular. All the sensory fibers of the fifth nerve synapse in this huge ganglion, the trigeminal ganglion. In relation to the dry bone, the trigeminal ganglion is located here. The opening for the three branches are the superior orbital fissure for the ophthalmic, the foramen rotundum for maxillary, and the foramen ovale for the mandibular. The first branch of the trigeminal, the ophthalmic nerve, passes forwards through the superior orbital fissure. As it passes through the fissure, it divides. It gives off the frontal nerve, which runs just beneath the roof of the orbit. It divides into the cutaneous branches which go to the forehead. In addition, the ophthalmic nerve gives rise to the lacrimal nerve, which supplies the lacrimal gland, and the nasociliary nerve, which gives off one or two ethmoidal nerves, and a cutaneous branch, the infratrochlear nerve. Nasociliary nerve gives the long ciliary nerves, which provide sensation to the eyeball. The branches of the frontal nerve that we saw emerge on the face around the orbital margins or through the opening in it. The branches of the frontal nerve are the supraorbital, the supratrochlear, and the infratrochlear. These supply the forehead and the upper eyelid and the upper part of the nose here. The ethmoidal branches of the nasociliary nerve supply this part of the lining of the nasal cavity. Now we'll see the branches of the ophthalmic nerve diagrammatically. We have already seen them in the dissection. This is the lacrimal nerve that supplies the lacrimal gland. It carries the fibers from the sphenopalatine ganglion, which we'll see later. This is the frontal nerve that divides into the supraorbital and the supratrochlear. These are the cutaneous branches that emerge from the superior orbital margin. This is the nasociliary nerve. The nasociliary nerve gives off the long ciliary nerves that pass through the ciliary ganglion here. It also gives the ethmoidal nerves. Its cutaneous branch is the infratrochlear nerve. So we'll just summarize the branches of the ophthalmic nerve. So ophthalmic nerve gives the lacrimal nerve that supplies the lacrimal gland. The fibers to the lacrimal gland through the lacrimal nerve come from the zygomatic nerve that receives these fibers from the sphenopalatine ganglion that carries the fibers of seventh nerve. We'll see this part later when we study the sphenopalatine ganglion. The next branch is the frontal, which is the largest branch. That gives the supraorbital and the supratrochlear, which are the cutaneous branches. The third branch is the nasociliary. The nasociliary gives long ciliary nerves that pass through the ciliary ganglion to supply the eyeball. It gives a sensory supply to the eyeball. If you remember, the short ciliary nerve were the branches of the third nerve, while the long ciliary nerve, they are the branches of the nasociliary nerve, which is branch of ophthalmic nerve, which is a branch of fifth nerve. The second branch of the nasociliary is the ethmoidal nerves. We have anterior and posterior ethmoidal nerves. Third is the cutaneous branch, that is the infratrochlear nerve. So that summarizes the ophthalmic nerve. We'll go ahead with the maxillary nerve. In the middle cranial fossa, before entering the foramen rotundum, the maxillary nerve gives middle meningeal nerve. Then it leaves the cranial cavity through foramen rotundum to enter the pterygopalatine fossa. In the pterygopalatine fossa, it gives the zygomatic nerve, the pterygopalatine nerve, through which hangs the pterygopalatine ganglion, and that ganglion then gives the orbital, the nasal, and the palatine branches. And it also gives the posterior superior alveolar nerve here. This PSA passes on the back surface of the maxilla to enter the maxillary bone and supplies the teeth. The maxillary nerve continues in the infraorbital canal as infraorbital nerve, where it gives the anterior superior alveolar nerve and the middle superior alveolar nerve. Then it emerges through the intraorbital foramen to give the terminal branches, which are the cutaneous branches. At this point, we'll study about the pterygopalatine ganglion. Pterygopalatine ganglion is actually the parasympathetic ganglion of 7th nerve. The 7th nerve, it receives the parasympathetic fibers from the lacrimatory nucleus that are carried by the greater petrosal nerve, which is a branch of the 7th nerve, to the median nerve. We'll be talking about this again. This median nerve, or the nerve to pterygoid canal, it reaches the pterygopalatine ganglion. This pterygopalatine ganglion is actually hanging from the maxillary nerve. Anatomically, it is associated very close to the maxillary nerve. But the fibers are actually coming from the facial nerve that just accompany the maxillary nerve and relay here. And the postganglionic, they re-enter the maxillary. So maxillary nerve just acts as a pathway. But actually the fibers are coming from the 7th nerve. Maxillary nerve later gives a branch called as the zygomatic nerve, as we have seen in the earlier slide. These postganglionic fibers of the pterygopalatine ganglion, which are actually coming from the lacrimatory nucleus through the 7th nerve, they just join this zygomatic nerve. This zygomatic nerve continues, and here it meets one branch from the ophthalmic nerve. This branch is the lacrimal. Zygomatic branch meets the lacrimal nerve. And these parasympathetic fibers, which are coming from the facial nerve to the ganglion, to the maxillary nerve, to the zygomatic nerve, then go and join the lacrimal. And through this nerve, then they are carried to the lacrimal gland. So your pterygopalatine ganglion is actually the parasympathetic ganglion of 7th nerve. The branches of the 7th nerve, that is the greater petrosal nerve, we'll be talking about when we see the 7th nerve. And we'll be revising this whole sequence again there. In this diagram, we see the cross connection of the facial nerve with the trigeminal ganglion. This is your maxillary nerve. These are the two rootlets by which the pterygopalatine ganglion hangs to the maxillary nerve. And this is the facial nerve, as seen in blue color. Facial nerve goes in the facial canal in the petrostemporal bone. In the facial canal, it gives a branch, the greater petrosal nerve. This greater petrosal nerve carries the fibers which are actually coming from lacrimatory nucleus. The greater petrosal nerve, it joins one more nerve that comes from the plexus on the internal carotid. This is the sympathetic. This sympathetic, the deep petrosal nerve, joins the greater petrosal nerve to form this nerve, that is nerve to pterygoid canal, which is also called as median nerve. This median nerve goes through the pterygoid canal and enters the pterygopalatine fissure, where it meets the sphenopalatine or the pterygopalatine ganglion. Herein, these parasympathetic fibers, they relay, and the postganglionic fibers, they re-enter the maxillary nerve, as we had been talking earlier. While these sympathetic fibers, they do not relay because they are already the postganglionic fibers, but they accompany the parasympathetic. And these sympathetic and parasympathetic, they are carried by the zygomatic to the lacrimal. That is how is the cross connect. The same thing in different perspective. This is the genuine, this is the facial nerve. This is the greater petrosal nerve, the parasympathetic branch of the facial nerve. This is the internal carotid artery here. This in blue color is the deep petrosal nerve. They are joined together to form the nerve to pterygoid canal and relay into this. Next we come to the mandibular nerve. The mandibular nerve exits the cranial cavity through foramen ovale. It is also accompanied by a motor branch. This motor branch joins the mandibular nerve as soon as it exits from the foramen ovale. After joining, the mandibular branch and the motor branch, they continue as undivided portion and later divide into the anterior and the posterior division. The undivided portion gives nervus spinosus and nerve to internal pterygoid. This nerve to internal pterygoid gives two more branches. The branch to the tensor veli palatini, this is the tensor muscle of the palate, and one more branch to the tensor tympani, that is the muscle in the ear. These are very commonly asked MCQ. This tensor veli palatini is the only muscle of the palate which is supplied by mandibular nerve. All the other muscles of the palate are supplied by the pharyngeal plexus. Then we have the anterior division. This is the division that gives supply to most of the muscles of the mastication except the internal pterygoid. Internal pterygoid has already been supplied by the undivided portion. So the anterior division, it gives the lateral pterygoid, that is the external pterygoid, masseter, the temporal, and the long buccal. This long buccal nerve is the only sensory part of the anterior division. So most of the anterior division is motor and supplies the muscles of the mastication. But it has one branch, that is a long buccal branch, that is a sensory branch. We'll be talking about it again. The posterior division gives the auriculotemporal nerve, the lingual nerve, and the inferior alveolar nerve. Inferior alveolar nerve gives the mylohyoid branch before it enters the mandibular canal to supply the teeth. So this mylohyoid branch, it supplies the mylohyoid muscle and the anterior belly of digastric. We'll see all these branches diagrammatically. This is a mandibular nerve. This is the undivided portion of the mandibular nerve. This undivided portion gives nerve to medial pterygoid, which is not seen here, and nervus spinosus. Nerve to medial pterygoid gives branches to tensor veli palatini and tensor tympani. This is the anterior division that gives the nerve supply to the remaining muscles of mastication other than the medial pterygoid, and it also gives the buccal nerve. This buccal nerve pierces the buccinator and supplies the mucous membrane as well as the skin on the top of the buccinator. So although it pierces buccinator, be very careful, it does not supply the buccinator muscle. Buccinator muscle receives its motor supply from facial nerve. So the buccal nerve, which is only the sensory branch, supplies the skin over the buccinator, while the buccinator itself is supplied by the facial. Then we talk about the posterior division. In the posterior division, we have the lingual nerve. This lingual nerve receives a branch from the facial. If you can see, this is the facial nerve here. It receives a branch from the facial. This is the chorda tympani. Chorda tympani is actually bringing the parasympathetic fibers from the salivatory nucleus, from the superior salivatory nucleus. So the chorda tympani, it joins the lingual nerve, continues down here, and here in submandibular ganglion, it releases postganglionic fibers. They go back again with the lingual nerve, and here it supplies the submandibular salivary gland as well as the sublingual salivary gland. That is the chorda tympani that brings the parasympathetic supply for the salivary gland, that is the submandibular and the sublingual salivary gland, while the rest of the lingual nerve, it is sensory to the tongue. Chorda tympani also carries the special senses of the anterior two-thirds of the tongue. So the taste senses of the anterior two-thirds of the tongue are carried by the chorda tympani. Then we have this division, that is the inferior alveolar nerve, that enters the mandibular canal. But before entering the mandibular canal, it gives out this branch, that is the mylohyoid branch, that supplies the mylohyoid muscle and the anterior belly of digastric. The anterior belly of digastric and the mylohyoid muscle. This is the nerve mylohyoid. While your inferior alveolar nerve continues inside the mandibular canal and supply all the teeth till the incisors. Here it gives one more cutaneous branch, the mental branch, that supplies the skin and the gingiva and the mucous membrane in this area. Herein we can see one more branch of the posterior division, the auriculotemporal nerve. The auriculotemporal nerve, it emerges as two rootlets. These two rootlets, they surround an artery, the middle meningeal artery. This is an MCQ here. There's one more MCQ, that auriculotemporal nerve is related to which foramen. This nerve itself does not enter through any foramen. But now the answer to this question, that auriculotemporal nerve is related to which foramen, it is related to foramen spinosum, because if you see this middle meningeal artery, it passes through foramen spinosum, An auricular temporal nerve is related just inferior to it. That is why the answer for that particular question is foramen spinosum. If you know the anatomy, it will be easy for you to answer such questions. This auricular temporal nerve carries the fibers from the otic ganglion, which we will be studying a little later. Next, we will see the otic ganglion. This is the third ganglion, the third parasympathetic ganglion we are talking about today. The first ganglion was the ciliary ganglion that was associated with the oculomotor nerve. The second ganglion that we discussed was functionally associated with the facial nerve but was very close to the maxillary nerve. And this is the third ganglion, the otic ganglion, which, as we had seen in the earlier slide, is situated very close to the mandibular nerve but is functionally associated with the ninth nerve, that is the glossopharyngeal. It brings the parasympathetic fibers from the inferior salivatory fibers. They are carried by the glossopharyngeal. Herein we can see the glossopharyngeal nerve. The glossopharyngeal nerve gives a tympanic branch. This tympanic branch goes and forms a tympanic plexus here. From the tympanic plexus arises a branch called as the lesser petrosal nerve. This lesser petrosal nerve relays into the otic ganglion. The postganglionic fibers from the otic ganglion, they enter the auriculotemporal nerve, and this auriculotemporal nerve carries these fibers to the parotid gland. We'll see the course again, this time in blue color. This is a glossopharyngeal nerve. This is a tympanic branch that forms a tympanic plexus in the middle ear that gives out a branch called as the lesser petrosal nerve. The lesser petrosal nerve relays into the otic ganglion. Postganglionic fibers, they enter the auriculotemporal nerve, which is very close to the ganglion, and this auriculotemporal nerve carries these postganglionic fibers to the parotid gland. In this diagram, we can see both the otic ganglion and the pterygopalatine ganglion very clearly. This is the facial nerve and the two bends. That is, this is the first bend of the facial nerve, the chin. From the first bend of the facial nerve, it gives a branch that is the greater petrosal nerve. The greater petrosal. We have seen that this greater petrosal joins the deep petrosal nerve that comes from the sympathetic plexus on the internal carotid and form the nerve to pterygoid canal that relays into the pterygopalatine. It also gives the chorda tympani. Chorda tympani, that is, carries the parasympathetic from the superior salivatory nucleus. It carried from superior salivatory nucleus, and with the lingual nerve, it went to the submandibular ganglion and supplied the submandibular and the sublingual salivary. Now, just in the same region, we see the ninth nerve here. This is the ninth nerve that gives a tympanic branch that goes inside the ear cavity, the middle ear, where it forms a tympanic plexus. This tympanic plexus then gives a lesser petrosal nerve that relays into the otic ganglion. Postganglionic fibers enter the auriculotemporal nerve, which is the branch of the posterior division, and then carried to the parotid gland. So, point to be remembered, the greater petrosal is a branch of facial nerve. The parasympathetic fibers come from the lacrimatory nucleus, carried to the pterygopalatine, and from here carried to the lacrimal gland. Chorda tympani. It has the fibers from superior salivatory nucleus. They are carried to the gland, that is the submandibular and the sublingual. Glossopharyngeal nerve. It has the fibers from inferior salivatory nucleus. These fibers, taken up by the tympanic branch, form the plexus, the lesser petrosal, the otic ganglion, the auriculotemporal, and then the parotid. Try to revise these pathways as many times as possible because that is the only way to remember them. Next we come to the cranial nerve 7, the facial nerve. In the facial nerve, we'll try to understand its major divisions. In the facial nerve, first we'll see the major components of the facial nerve. The branchial motor or the special visceral efferent. The names are important. We'll see how. We'll also see what they mean. We have two types of viscera. First and foremost, the term efferent. The term efferent refers to the motor supply. So we have efferent, and then we have afferent, that is the sensory, and efferent. In efferents, we have two types of efferents. One is the motor supplied to the general viscera. When we say general viscera, it's something like glands, GIT, all the viscera or the internal organ are general viscera. And muscles, they are the special viscera. So special visceral efferent and general visceral efferent. When we say efferents, we have the general sensory and the special sensory. So these are the components of the facial nerve. Now when we talk about the special visceral efferent or the muscle supplied to the muscle, it's also called as branchial motor. The branchial motor includes the muscles to the facial expression, posterior belly of the digastric, the stylohyoid and the stapedius. Then we have the general viscera or the visceral motor. It gives a parasympathetic innervation to the lacrimal. If you remember, it supplies the lacrimal gland via the pterygopalatine gland. It supplies submandibular and the sublingual gland via the submandibular ganglia, as well as it supplies the mucous membrane of the nasopharynx, the heart and the soft palate. It also gives the special sensory, that is the taste sensation from the anterior two-thirds of the tongue and the heart and the soft palate, which is carried by the chorda tympani. Then it gives the general sensory sensation from the skin of the concha of the auricle and small area behind the ear. Most of the sensory supply to the face is by the trigeminal nerve. Facial nerve only has a small share, that is skin of the concha of the auricle, and a small area behind the ear is supplied by the facial nerve. Facial nerve has a very complex course inside the facial canal. It enters the facial canal through internal acoustic meatus. Inside the facial canal, it has two bends. The first bend is very sharp and it is called as genu or geniculate ganglion. And then second bend is gradual. Then it comes out through the stylomastoid foramen just behind the styloid troughs. Inside the facial canal, it has three major branches. First branch, greater petrosal nerve. We have already seen about this. The second branch is nerve to stapedius. And the third branch is the chorda tympani. So the greater petrosal nerve, as we have seen earlier, is the parasympathetic branch that carry the fibers from the lacrimal nucleus. It joins the deep petrosal to form nerve to pterygoid canal and relays in the pterygopalatine ganglia. Second branch, that is the nerve to stapedius, supplies the muscle in the ear, that is the stapedius muscle. This muscle in the ear is associated with dampening of sound. That means it dampens any sharp sound that comes. If this muscle is somehow paralyzed, maybe because of the paralysis of seventh nerve, what will happen? We'll hear very loud noise which is called as hyperacusis, which is because of the paralysis of stapedius. Then the third branch is the chorda tympani that carries the fibers from superior salivatory nucleus to the submandibular ganglion. It also carries the sensation from the anterior two-thirds of the tongue, the taste sensation and the general sensation. We've already seen the branches. In the facial canal, we have nerve to stapedius, the chorda tympani, the greater petrosal nerve. As soon as it exits from the stylomastoid foramen, it gives the posterior auricular that supplies the small area of the skin behind the ear. It supplies the digastric, the posterior belly, and the stylohyoid muscle. So the muscle supplied by the facial nerve, a digastric, the stylohyoid. And on the face, it gives the terminal branches, that is the temporal, zygomatic, buccal, mandibular and cervical that supply the facial muscles. So muscles supplied by the facial nerve, the facial muscles, the posterior belly of digastric and the stylohyoid. The seventh and eighth nerve leave the brainstem just below the pons. Here is the facial and here is the vestibulocochlear. To follow them, we'll look at the dissection of the posterior cranial fossa in which the cerebellum has been removed. Here is the back of the petrous temporal bone. Here are the seventh and the eighth nerve. This is the vestibulocochlear nerve. This is the facial nerve. Together, they pass through this opening, the internal auditory meatus. Here is the internal auditory meatus in the dry skull. It is a short tunnel with three openings. The facial nerve passes forward through this one to enter its own bony cavity the facial canal. In the facial canal, the facial nerve has a complex course in the petrous temporal bone passing round the wall of the tympanic cavity and emerging from the stylomastoid foramen here. To get a view of its course, we'll remove the front wall of the external auditory meatus along this line. We have also cut open a small part of the petrous temporal bone here. To represent the facial nerve, we'll add this green wire to the picture. Entering its canal, the facial nerve passes forward briefly and then makes this abrupt U-turn called the genuine and passes backward. Now we come around to the outside and into the tympanic cavity. Here the facial nerve passes backwards, high in the medial wall of the tympanic cavity. It then turns downwards to emerge here at the stylomastoid foramen, just behind the root of the styloid process. On its way through the temporal bone, it gives three branches. The greater petrosal nerve, which is the autonomic branch, a branch in the middle ear, the nervus stapedius, and has a special branch, the chorda tympani, represented by this wire. The chorda tympani passes upward on the inside of the tympanic membrane